Welcome to the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. I'm JD Wilson, and I'm here with my 5-year-old in the background. And today on the show, we have got one of our favorite people. It's Miss Jacque Rowe Fields, recurring guest. You've heard her on other episodes before, but we wanted Miss Jacque to talk today in our series, what we're calling We're All Human. We wanted to look at a complex issue of generational trauma. And so I'll say a disclaimer first off. If you have been following any kind of national news, international news at the time of this podcast airing, it has been an absolutely brutal week for us in the city of Memphis. And so you will hear definitely a more somber tone in us in the beginning as we're talking. Just because we were fresh off of 2 pretty horrific tragedies that have kind of rocked our city. And I just share that because it might sound like it's an extra somber beginning, but also because it pertains directly to our conversation with Miss Jacque today. And so without any further ado, let's get to her now. Here she is, Miss Jacque Rowe Fields. Well, as I said in the open, we're here with Jacque Rowe Fields and Becca McKay today. And just to give some prefacing before we start into this conversation today, many of you know this, that Empowered to Connect is headquartered in Memphis, Tennessee. And at the time that we're recording this, we have been in the middle of one of the worst weeks that we can all remember for our city. And so if you have followed news, we're not going to roll through the whole series of events, but Eliza Fletcher was kidnapped and murdered earlier in this week. And then last night, there was a man that went on a Facebook Live shooting spree around our city. And as of now, 4 people are dead from that. There's a few still in the hospital. And it's one of those, it's a moment, and it reminds me of, different size tragedies, but it reminds me of waking up after 9/11 and thinking, what happened? Like, what am I supposed to do now? Like, in full disclosure, I drove home a few minutes ago to change clothes and get ready for a bigger meeting where I need to be dressed like a grown up. And so I came back over, and as I'm driving back to the office, I'm driving through one of the intersections where a young lady was murdered last night. And you wouldn't be able to tell from looking around that happened. Life is sort of moving on, but all of us feel a little bit stuck today. And so if you hear an extra somber tone or kind of extra bit of anger or fire in our voices as we talk about this topic today, it's because we are all mad, feeling it. We're sad, heartbroken, you name it. And so lots of layers to where we're at today. But this topic that we had picked to talk about today feels like it was, and I'll just use the word providential, that this was what we're going to talk about today with who we're going to talk about. Becca and Jacque and I worked together years and years ago in a school setting in Memphis, in one of the tougher neighborhoods in the city, for lack of a better explanation. We don't have to go through all of our terms and all that, but we had lots of days of coming back into the school feeling like this, or something had happened in the neighborhood the night before, or something had happened midday, and we walked back in and just felt heavy and didn't know how to process. And so we knew, in talking about this topic today, we wanted to talk with Jacque. So Jacque, thank you for being here with us today. And maybe we need to start by acknowledging you and I have a little bit of a disease, Jacque, that in extremely hard moments, we have inappropriate laughter disease, where we tend to cope in some form or fashion by making jokes that some people might not feel fit the moment. And so we are going to refrain from that today. You and I are, best we can.
Or we can just explain how it's helpful to the healing process. We can roll with it a little bit.
So that's it's a long introduction. I didn't even say the topic we're talking about today, but we're talking about generational trauma. And so Jacque, for us, when we look at what happened today, or what happened this week, 2 pretty specific situations where I think those of us with a mind to see would look straight at generational trauma as one of the factors in these things. So why don't we start there? Would you just sort of walk us through the idea of generational trauma, and then we'll go from there?
JD, hello everyone. Hi Becca.
Good to see you,
So
Jacque
good
Rowe.
to see you. And JD, you're right. After such a tough few days, this is delightful to see the faces of friends that I hold so dear. JD, I would like to chime in on something you said about 9/11. That literally last night I said to myself, this is what the city must have felt like after MLK was assassinated. And I think your term of heaviness is the right one, right? We just you feel a heaviness to the community that I have never experienced before, but I thought this must be what it was like after the assassination of Dr. King. And so that in and of itself talks about generational trauma, right? Trauma that's passed down from age to age to age and manifests itself in a variety of ways. But sometimes people can put their finger on it and name it. And sometimes we are not able to name it as generational trauma.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking like a few years from now, I'm thinking about one of the murders this week that happened was a runner. Mm-hmm. And I've seen already circulated probably like 50 or 60 different like tips, basically like how can we avoid that? And I think, while we should do what we can to feel safe. Like we should do the things that we can to create felt safety. But I'm also thinking like a few years from now, we're going to have maybe a hypersensitive running community and it's going to be, maybe we're not going to trace it back only to this incident. And then I think about my brother and sister-in-law were in a pretty terrible tornado when they were in college. It destroyed the whole campus. It leveled the whole campus. And I came to the same college 4 years later. So when I came, nobody who had been through the tornado was still there. But the way they approached tornado drills at that university was so intense. Yeah. I mean, it was, I came from a place where there wasn't tornadoes. So my only introduction to tornadoes was like, we have steel reinforced bathrooms and we will go in when the sirens start. And if they don't stop for 6 hours, we're in the bathroom for 6 hours. Like it was not the culture. Now, here where we live, there's times when people will kind of be out on the front porch looking or whatever, but the university had some collective trauma and it got passed down by the staff members who were there, right? Because the students had all graduated. They were gone. They had moved on. Yeah. But now I'm super panicky about tornadoes. And it's like, yes, it was more connected to me maybe because of my brother, but I wasn't there. I was not in the situation, but I internalized that based on my experience there. So I think when I think about generational trauma, I'm thinking about what led up to the two events that happened this week. I'm thinking ahead of like what it's going to look like in the future. And there's just a lot to unpack with this idea of the idea that we can pass on trauma to other people. Either by being violent and by creating trauma or by the way that we respond to the trauma that we've experienced.
Because it certainly seeps into, the systems and the structures that govern the way we live. Like you're talking about your campus's tornado response, but you made me think about when I was in high school, I was in a tornado. And that was a very traumatic experience for me and my siblings. My mom was at work and I'm the oldest. And so I was responsible for us. And so now I have a 5-year-old grandson. And if the weather looks like it could be tornadic, he already knows the drill, right? Because I have passed down my own very traumatic tornado experience to him. Now, my husband, he's out looking in the back and standing, he's like, well, look up there. Look up there. And I'm like,
I don't even think it's that bad out there.
Yeah.
What just flew by? And I'm like, assume the position, So,
yeah.
But
we
may not even know the source of it, Becca. Like you said, you know the history, but other students there may not even know that history.
Right.
Which I think leads straight back into our starting place here, right? We think about the things that happened this week and to those of us who are just walking into the discussion blind right now and just hearing this the first time, you're like, you're talking about two like violent events. Like, what are you talking about? Generational. It wasn't a father-son duo that committed this. Like, what are you talking about? Generational trauma. And so you started touching on it just now with the systems and different cultural components that can come with that. And so why don't we dive into that faction of this? Because this is the same, it's different language, different events, different circumstances, but this idea transcends geographical location and cultures and history, right?
Mm-hmm. And biology, JD, because some would say that trauma is passed on to your offspring through DNA. So there's a biological component to it as well.
Yeah. And so when we look at, these situations, particularly, why would we draw those associations in the situations we led with talking about this week in Memphis?
I think that's an important question.
I keep coming back to, I think, the question of generational trauma. I think we can repeat, what's the right word? We can repeat violence. We can repeat perpetrating trauma on someone else. That can be generational. I think we can repeat unhelpful, hypervigilant, hyper-scared victim responses. And I think we have an opportunity to create good patterns, like good, healthy patterns. And I know it's silly to mention, but we started by saying we sometimes laugh about inappropriate things, but I think creating communities of healing is being somebody who can stare something really difficult in the face, choose to keep walking forward, choose to keep showing up for each other, make it light whenever we can. You know what I mean? I think it's the super complicated thing to untangle. So I wonder, Jacque Rowe, talk about people who have experienced trauma and then go on to create trauma for other people. I mean, you've done so much work for your whole lifetime. You've seen that in a lot of different spaces. Like, what kinds of things can we learn from that?
Mm-hmm. So, you all know that I've worked in education my entire life, but I've worked with different age groups from pre-K all the way through college. And so what's so interesting about it to me is that no matter the age group, trauma shows up in some similar ways. And it may be violent, it may be angry, it may be the response. And Becca, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking about that myself, that we often think about trauma as the perpetration and how it looks when someone's being violent or perpetrating that. But we don't often think about trauma is also a learned response to a situation or to something. And we rarely ever talk about trauma in terms of providing a healing space. How does a community heal from trauma? If we could figure that piece out, then we may be able to intercept that generational trauma that keeps being passed down. But we don't focus on that very often. But it shows up no matter how old you are, where you live, ethnic background, nationality. A trauma that's passed on from generation to generation bubbles up over and over and over again. And I'm rambling now, Becca, and I don't remember your question because I'm thinking about a book that I read. Matter of fact, I have it here because I wanted to be sure to share it. Have you guys ever read this? My Grandmother's Hands?
No.
I've heard of it, but I have not read it yet.
Oh, put this on your reading list, okay? So this book is so germane to our topic today, because this book talks about what this author saw their grandmother experience in life, which, again, we don't realize the source. So have you heard the story about the ham? About why did the wife cut off the...
Tell it again.
So there's this analogy about this young couple, they're newlyweds, they get married, it's their first big Thanksgiving dinner, and the bride's so excited she's going to cook the family ham. And so she gets the ham all cleaned and prepped, and she slices off the end, and the husband says, "Why do you slice off the end of the ham?" And she thought, you know what? I don't know. I'm going to call my mom and ask. So she called Mom. And she says, "Mom, I'm getting ready for dinner. I'm cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Why do we slice off the end of the ham?" And the mother says, "I don't know. My mother's just always done that." So she calls her mother and she says, "Mom, I've got Becca, the new bride, on the phone who wants to know, why do we slice off the end of the ham?" And the grandmother says, and we're talking 3 generations of women now, grandmother, mother, and the daughter. "Why do we slice off the end of the ham?" And the grandmother says, "Because I didn't have a pan big enough." So That's the JD. You've never heard that story, JD.
No, I never.
But it's a great illustration of how we have a response that travels from generation to generation, and we don't even know the source. The cause was the ham. The pan was too small, and so she sliced it off as a response, as the solution, because a lot of our coping mechanisms is just about survival, right? Grandmother sliced off the end of the ham for survival purposes. Her daughter watched her do that. That daughter watched her do that. And now that we've healed that issue, her children won't slice out the end of the ham because there won't be a need to. But that was passed down for generation to generation.
Man.
What do
This
you
book
think?
is great, you guys. It kind of captures that
Talk
story.
about that a little bit. Tell a little teaser of it for people who haven't read it, because I haven't read it.
So the title is My Grandmother's Hand. It's racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies. And the important part of it is the pathway to mending. And this talks about racialized trauma because I think it is important to talk about how trauma looks in different ethnic groups because, different ethnic groups have experienced different kinds of trauma and they have different coping mechanisms for dealing with it. But it's universal in the aspect that trauma happens everywhere. Trauma is no respecter of persons, right? It is no respecter of persons. And so what I think is really groovy about this is it talks about, number one, how trauma really does affect you physically. I think that's another aspect that we don't talk often about. And then it gives some notion that, yes, we have been traumatized, but there's hope. There's hope for healing. And we don't often get to the hope for healing part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking you touched on just racial trauma and the cycles that brings up, and specifically here in the U.S. And I know that we've talked about it with Tom and Don Jordy before in South Africa. Like whether you want to zoom all the way back to the colonialism type stuff and imperialism and conquering and all that, or we want to fast forward a little bit to slavery, or we want to fast forward a little bit. I mean, we can look and find a pretty intense, at least in the U.S. specifically, a really intense kind of segmented history where people of different ethnic backgrounds were pitted against each other, and then their kids were pitted against each other, and their kids were pitted against each other. And so I think that's where I start to come to in this conversation, because one of the most difficult dynamics that can exist with that, because we hear about Hatfields and McCoys, and that's a similar type of passed down hate, so to speak. But this situation we're talking about also involved class, and then that systemic oppression of one group of people over another group of people because of power dynamics. And so that's when we start to get into conversations that you get extremely complex looking at it now and trying to then figure out, well, what are we supposed to do now? And so, Jackie, I wonder if you have any thoughts along those lines, like in terms of like, Becca said this morning, we were talking about this and we talked about, the need for juvenile justice systems that are well informed. One of the people this week that committed one of the crimes, rap sheet started at 11 years old and was filled all the way through going to jail at 16, and jail for 20 years, gets out and immediately picks right back up where they left off. And so there's just this discussion of like, well, is this person just a monster, or what would have helped along those ways? And you begin to look back at, well, the system failed him. And Becca said, yeah, but we can do all the systems work we want if the families are not reached, if the families are not equipped, prepared, if the families are not holding that, then the whole thing falls apart in our society.
That sounds like Becca's talking from some personal work experience where she's tried to address all the wraparounds, but at the end of the day, if the family is in an unhealthy state, and that's family, however you define family, because we've got to accept that family looks a lot broader and more diverse than what we traditionally have wanted to define it. We can do all the systems work in the world, but I think it is important to do the systems work. It's not either or, it's and. it's this and that. All these things have to happen simultaneously. I was thinking about the young man also last night, and I was thinking about the fact that in the elementary school, I could have pointed him out.
Mm.
And I don't know him, but I know students like
Yes.
I imagine he was like when he was in elementary school. And there are not the systems in place to support students and families in that way. And part of that is it's honestly about how we define family. There are so many things put in place that are supposed to be there to be protective, but are actually restrictive. I think about all those grandmothers that I had the opportunity to work with who didn't have legal say because they weren't the legal guardian, but they were the primary caregiver.
Right.
They were the person of influence. They were the matriarch of the family, but legally, they didn't have, the right to make decisions that would have worked on behalf of those children. So I think it's family as an ecosystem, and that's how I think about it. Think about it as an ecosystem, and when one part of the ecosystem isn't working well, then none of the ecosystem can function well. If you think about your gut, I'm all into gut health right now, you guys. If any part of your gut health system isn't working well, it throws off your entire ecosystem, your entire body as an ecosystem. So I can't just work on getting, strong arms and I have weak legs.
Right. That's right.
We've got to think about this and that. It's not either or.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I feel like anytime that there's something that makes the national news, you just immediately get a swarm of 1 sentence, 3 sentence. Well, if only they did blank, then this wouldn't happen. And I've been processing last night, even like, why does that make me so mad? And I think it is, I'm a social worker. And I think a lot of times people say, where was the mental health care? Yeah. And I'm sitting there going, but I've been the social worker for the 5th grader. And I've sat next to someone like Jacque Rowe Fields as the community engagement coordinator, and we've provided everything that we could. And that's so important. I love that you said that, Jacque Rowe. It's both and. That kid needed that. And they needed the football coach who took an interest in them. And they needed the grandmother who could step in. And they needed the uncle who could take them to get their haircut on Saturdays. And they just needed like the whole ecosystem. And so I'm glad you said that because I hope, I don't know, Jacque Rowe, when we come to this podcast, right, we have some big picture goals in mind, and we want people to walk away feeling encouraged. Like we want them to know, here's something practical I can do. And so I don't want to make it sound discouraging, but at the same time, I want people to understand the complexity. There's no quick fixes when it comes to personal trauma. And there's for sure no quick fixes when it comes to generational trauma. So if you are the school social worker, keep going. If you are the juvenile justice worker, keep going. If you're the grandmother, keep going. Like, I think we've all got to keep going. And we can't look at someone's life and go, well, if only they had a great school social worker when they were 11, this would have never happened. Or you can't say, well, obviously the juvenile justice system did nothing for that kid. We don't know that. We don't know what pieces of that person's story came into play. We don't know. And I think we can hold the complexity of that. I think we can hold how sad it is and hard it is that like sometimes this happens and it's hard to watch. Something we talked about this morning, Jacque Rowe, in our staff meeting was this idea of like, for people who generally feel safe, tragedy and violence can hit super hard. And for people who violence and tragedy is part of their like day-to-day life, they can be a little bit more desensitized or numb to it. And so I think I would just love to hear, I mean, this may be too big of a question, Jacque Rowe, but like, what do you think that the community can do for each other when we come to these big, tough moments? Like, how can we support each other? Like I don't know, what ideas do you have?
I will tell you, JD's comment earlier, it really hit me like a ton of bricks when he said he drove past the intersection and kind of life was going on like normal. And I don't have all the answers, but I will certainly tell you, I wish we could all pause. Like, could we have a collective pause? Could we do a community lament? Could we have some time as a group to experience grief, to express some sadness? Can we make space where we could do that as a collective? We don't pause to do that, and I work in a school currently, and our school is back at school today. And one of the incidents was literally a stone's throw from our school, like 2 schools, 3 schools. There are 3 schools in the neighborhood, and everyone's back at school today. And I'm like, this is not reasonable in my mind to think that children are going to come back to school and function as if nothing has happened. If nothing else, at school, we need a collective pause to acknowledge that this is heavy and that people may be feeling sad and angry, because I've done this. I've been sad, I've been angry, disbelief. And I think if I could wave a wand and wish we could do anything, it would be pause for a moment, a collective pause, to take a deep breath, to acknowledge what the community is experiencing. And different people do experience it differently, Becca, because you're right. For me, this was mind-blowing. For someone else, they may have been like, yeah, hey, people drive through my neighborhood shooting things up all the time.
That's right.
But even in that, there's a middle ground. Even at both extremes, we can come together somewhere together as a collective. And that would be where I would start.
I have this thought as we try to turn the corner into maybe some like hope giving things or ideas. This is one of them, right? To collectively pause in that moment. Like, I'll just share a personal story, and I know that my family would not. We've shared this before. That involves both of y'all. I mean, we were living in the neighborhood where we all worked in the school before, and there's one afternoon a shooting broke out in the street, and I was kind of stuck in the parking lot and couldn't make it through to my house to check on the kids until the shooting died down. So the shooting dissipates and everybody takes off, and I run across the street to check and see if everybody's okay. And the kids are playing in the living room, and my wife's cooking, and she said, I think, and she kind of did the motion for a gun. I think I just heard gunshots. And sure enough, I checked on her, knew the police were coming. So I was kind of like, and this is, again, part of this collective trauma. I was like, all right, if you guys are fine, I'm just going to head on back to work, because that was it was so common that we just kind of knew, okay, if the police are coming, we'll be fine. We'll take off. And I think this is the first time I told that story where that catches me. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And so I go back to work, and my wife calls me a few minutes later freaking out because our 3-year-old had brought her a bullet and said, Mom, what's this? And Elizabeth looks up, and there's a hole in the ceiling where a bullet had come right through the living room while all the kids were in there playing, and had hit off the wall and come to rest on the floor. And in that moment, I felt so invaded and scared and angry and hurt and all those things. But I'll tell you something that has changed, and I believe will have changed us generationally, is that next day. So that rest of that night was kind of chaotic, and we all slept, kids away from the windows and stuff, just because we were just paranoid, and just we're like, if anything else breaks out tonight, we don't want them near that front bedroom where stuff could happen. So we all slept sort of in the back of the house that night. And so the next day, I was sharing with both of you, like, we're just struggling today. I'm mad. Like, I hate this place. I can't believe that we're living here. This is so stupid. Like, why are we here? And just being honest, with you guys. And so after school, we canceled afternoon programs, and everybody's from the school that was part of our school family, so to speak. You two are part of this. Becca took our kids back into the back of the house, and our school family came over, surrounded us, and just loved on us, prayed for us, encouraged us, just sat and listened to us, cried with us, and just held that for a minute. Just gave us space to acknowledge, like, this is scary. We shouldn't be used to this. This shouldn't be normal. This shouldn't be something that we're desensitized to, where we can be tough and roll on like nothing happened. And it has set the precedent for us and for our kids and our family that anytime a friend of ours or someone that we love has a life-altering moment or life-interrupting moment, we stop what we're doing. We get on the stove and start cooking. Or we just call and order something. Or we, pause, we go to the store, we do what we need to, and we get over and we just are with our people as we need to be with them. And our kids are now seeing that modeled in a way that's completely normative. Like, wait, why aren't I going to practice tonight? Hey, this happened to so-and-so. Oh no, hang on, let me go make a card for them real quick. And our kids know that, like when life stops for our people, life stops for us, and we are there and we move. And y'all did that for us. Like, you guys set that precedent for us that we didn't have to be alone in that moment. And that was a massive thing for us to know that we were seen by you guys, but also that I could come and share honestly because you were right there with me, and you could handle it if I was honest about how bad that moment was. And that was huge for us. And so I can just say from a personal place of just, I know what that's like. I would co-sign that. And maybe I need on the way home, stand in the intersection for a second, not in the intersection, by the intersection for a few minutes and sit and reflect and think about that. Other ideas, Jackie, as we think about, ways that these cycles can be broken, because that is the hopeful part. We do know no one is condemned to a certain life because of their past or their family's past. Thoughts on like different ways those cycles can get interrupted that we might be able to have small parts in?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story, JD. I do remember that vividly, but it just hits different today. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. And that just that's a good confirmation for me about the power of seeing people and being there for your people. Because we're big about that. We're big about that.
Yeah.
But the other thing comes to my mind, you all, is, I believe knowledge is powerful. And there are academic-based, research-based, things that we know now, books that have been written, research that's been done that we can apply to trauma. And we don't do better because we don't know better, right? But we now have a source of knowledge that we can call upon, even just calling it trauma. I'll be honest with you, not so terribly long ago, we didn't know nothing about no trauma.
Right.
We did not use, I hear it everywhere now. Oh, it's trauma. We're traumatized. That's, fixed trauma. Right. We did not even know, we didn't have the language for it. So just having the language to name it is huge. And sometimes it's giving people those kinds of tools. That's really, really important. We're talking about how do we remain hopeful? We remain hopeful by educating and equipping ourselves. We fight back with knowledge on this. I'm okay. Me and my books. I got books over here, y'all. I got books. I know this is a book that you all use, right? What Happened to You? That's kind of, a staple. And then we also mentioned earlier, The Body Keeps Score, which is another staple that just gives you the language to be able to process and understand and support other people who are feeling the impact and the effects of trauma. But I will tell you, I'm going to mention one more book because I love this book so much. And this book, two more. So this is How the Word is Passed.
Oh, it's so good.
Clint Smith.
It's so good. It's one of my favorite books. And he reads the audiobook. So I know there are people who are paper book people. I'll tell you, if you are not, the audiobook is awesome. He reads it and it's so, so good.
So what's interesting to me is once you do understand generational trauma, or once you see the impact of generational trauma, you're then able to identify it, right? You're able to say, oh, you know what? That's what generational trauma looks like. He doesn't say the word generational trauma in this book.
Right.
It does not explicitly say it, but as he's going through the stories, and just to hint you guys, he goes to visit several different places and he kind of explores how the locations impact him. Once you have the language, you'll be able to process that through a filter. It's having the language is huge. So people who are working with folks, think about equipping people with language that they can express themselves. We do this all the time in elementary school. I know you all do this work. Becca and I have done this work together for sure. We want young people to have the language to be able to explain what they're feeling, process verbally what they're feeling. That's true for my grandmother. My grandmother didn't have the language. Mm-hmm. And so even reaching back that way and giving her language to help her express and explain, I think that's huge, huge, huge. Yeah. I'm with you, Becca and JD. I don't want anyone to feel like it's not a place of hope. As a matter of fact, if I had a tattoo, it'd be hope somewhere. Mm-hmm. If I had I'm not gonna have any more children, but if I got a puppy, I think I'd name my puppy Hope.
Miss, I got to say one thing and tell a story.
Go ahead.
I was a young baby intern working with Miss Jacque, and it was a tough year. A lot of things happened to us, among us, with us, and we were trying to make it to the end of the school year. And if you're a teacher, you've been there, you might be there today in September. And Miss Jacque wrote hope on a sticky note, taped it to a ruler, and it became our hope flag. And I'm not kidding. It was the hope stick. And we would literally, whoever was having a bad day, we would put that little flag hope stick like on their desk, and it would be passed around the office. And even, I think I found a picture of it the other day in our group text Miss Jacque and I have with some other people that we used to work with. When we're having a hard day, we do like remember the hope stick. And the point of the hope stick is we got to hold on to hope. We just have to. It's not easy. It's sometimes feels impossible. And so when I can't, Jacque Rowe holds it for me. When she can't, I hold it for her. Like, you have to have those people that will remind you of hold on to hope. And that's just something that I think I've held on to, this idea of like holding on to hope from job to job to job since then. And I think it's beyond work. It's just like a different way to think about life. The other thing I wanted to say is just the power of telling stories. So we've been through some things, the three of us on this podcast, and we joked about it at the beginning, laughing about it, but there's a couple of stories that we've told over and over and over again, some somber, some funny, somewhere in the mix. And I think about those pivotal moments in your life, like you do need to tell them a lot of times. That's healing. That's healthy. That's a good way to process. And so I think I like that you said at the very beginning, Jacque Rowe, like we need to pause as a community. And I think we don't need to be scared of stories. Sometimes I think, a month from now, people will be uncomfortable if we talk about it. People will we don't do a great job as a culture of grieving and of processing, but if we can hold one another's stories, not just the day after, right? Like today, our staff took a moment to pause and just like process together. And it was really great. It was a great moment together. But we talked about how are we going to support each other a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now, because stuff is going to keep happening to us, among us, with us. And so how do we keep telling stories, holding space, holding on to hope for each other? Like, how do we keep that spirit alive? And I think it takes work, and it takes being able to like wave the white flag and say like, I don't have it today, guys. Like, I don't have it. And then having your people that can hold you up on those days.
That's
so good, Becca. I love that. I'm sorry, JD, I cut you off.
Well, I just almost burst into uncontrollable laughter, even when Becca said we had to be able to tell stories together, because there have been so many moments that we have experienced where something just unimaginable is happening outside. And then the next day we'll be reflecting on it. And just a detail that might have seemed comical, not in that moment, but the next morning as we're retelling it, there might be a detail of that story that we had forgotten about that all of us can start laughing about. And so I even just to bring that up to give you permission that like sometimes like we don't have to, like when we have people who know us and we are, in a community where we are regularly interacting and people know us and we know them, like it is okay for us to laugh about things and to share them. And that is, at least for me, extremely healing. And if you are a person who is not a laugher in those moments, please let at least Jacque and I know, but let other people know so that you can't do that. But I think that idea of us processing through it, and it doesn't have to be a clinical, like cold mechanical processing of we are such complicated people. And so if there are moments we need to laugh about within that, that is what life is, right? Like there are no, singular, uncomplicated events that happen to us as human beings. And so all that said, I think, where I walk away today thinking for the future is that, one, everything matters. Like every interaction matters. Becca mentioned having students that she worked with. Jacque, you mentioned, being able to point out, air quotes, that student kind of as they're coming through elementary school. I texted y'all maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that the student I spent more time with than anybody else in the elementary school that I worked at, like, is in jail now and for a very, very long time in the future for something that he did. And it's like, I was a super engaged, like over engaged, even like in this kid's life, like doing everything I possibly could. And it's a reminder that we don't fix people, right? We do our job to be able to like interject hope and to teach and to bring alongside and all that. But we also know that if everybody does their part, we're good. And so if we can do our part and then we can fight for the right things to be done in systems and the right things to be done in homes, and it means that you're an involved voter. It means that you advocate for what your community needs specifically. It means that you are an attentive neighbor, and rather than rushing to judgment, rushing to be able to support families in your street that might be struggling, rather than restricting yourself from them. So all those things, all of the above. And it also means asking for help when we need it, when there's something that we can't get past and we're not sure why. Possibly there is something in our DNA that has been passed down to us that we don't understand. And adoptive parents, I think we need to all, like adoptive and foster parents, we need to zero in on this particular facet, because there might be behaviors and things we're seeing that we don't understand at home because there are different histories involved. And we need to be willing in those moments to ask the right questions, to ask for help from those that are around us who might be able to help us, and to hold those babies close in that unknown and let them know that there is one constant that does transcend the known and unknown. And that's if we're there for each other, that we love each other, like that does transcend our histories. And so
I love that, JD. I love that. And I really love what Becca said about the importance of stories. I think that a lot of trauma lives in silence. And so when you encourage people to share their story, I'll tell you, generationally, my grandparents, great-grandparents did not share their stories. They endured a lot of, oppression, racism, sexism, genderism, all the isms. But those stories didn't get passed on, but their reaction to those stories did get passed down. So, the fear, the second-class citizenry, the things that they got as a result of the trauma got passed on to us, and we didn't even know the story behind it. So I love the notion of making time to hear stories, to encourage people to share stories. Those babies got stories. That was one of my favorite things about being in an elementary school, is that kids love to tell you things about their life. If they know you're interested and you're going to listen, and I mean genuinely listen, not a pacifying listen, but an active listen. They'll tell stories, and there's healing in that, Becca. So that was so well said.
So true.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
Keep it alive.
Keep hope alive. You may not be able to save all the starfish, but that one that you pick up and throw back, that's the hope you need to get up for the next day.
Yep. Jacque, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great to see you. I love you guys. We got to get together in person.
I know, we need to. We'll do it soon. Well, hopefully that was as informative and helpful and practical for you as it was for us when we recorded it. Miss Jacque is just a treasure trove of information and just an incredible thinker. And we're just really glad to have been able to have her on. And so for everybody here at Empowered to Connect, for Kyle Wright, who edits and engineers all of our audio, for Tad Jewett, who created the music behind the Empowered to Connect podcast, and everybody here at ETC, That's it for us, and we'll see you next week on the Empowered to Connect podcast.